Today we're going to be talking about the parable of the talents as well as the genre of the parables. And the parable of the talents is a commonly understood or commonly known parable, but it also has its twists and turns, and we're going to talk about that. One of the things that impressed upon me this past week was the fact that I was thinking of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I'll just read that for you in the opening verses of chapter 15, when Paul says in verse 7, "Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach and so you believed." One of the striking things about that Paul says is, I worked harder than any of the apostles. Matthew is one of the apostles, and Paul saying that he worked harder than any of the apostles surprises me, and I couldn't figure that out, and I finally think that I have figured out what he means by that. Maybe you had already figured it out. Congratulations. I am seeing Paul doing something that is incredible. Every aspect of his life he devoted to not only the gospel, but to the communication of that gospel and the communication and the explanation of the scriptures, where he acts in a pastoral way. So we read his letters, which make up most of the New Testament. We see this in Paul, and everything he does is so that there might be the slightest glimmer of light coming into someone's heart for Jesus Christ. He lives his life entirely based upon that. And furthermore, the reason he was able to probably work a little harder than, say, Peter or James or John is because he was a Pharisee. And he had the tool set. He was a Roman citizen as well as a Jewish Pharisee. He had the tools necessary to communicate to an entire world that was deprived of God's grace because of their lack of faith. So in this lesson today, we're not going to be able to open up and unpack everything about the parable of the talents, nor any parable for that matter, but we're going to try to hit a theme that is going to make sense, and it's going to come across in a slightly different way as what I just said, with some light, hopefully. So I want to give you the impression or the interpretation that I'm going to give you for the parable of the talents up front. So if you want to go, where is he going with this? This is where we're going, and then you're going to get the rest of what I prepared. And there's 27 slides. So what you're going to get right up front is enter into the joy. It's the public investment view that I think is correct when we read the parable of the talents. And of course, if you just rip the parable of the talents out of its context like I'm kind of doing today, you're going to have difficulty. So the first two servants represent followers of Jesus who understood that the wealth of God's covenant was meant to be shared. By going out and trading, they represent the risky missionary work of the early church. They took the massive treasure entrusted to them, the news of the arriving kingdom, the message of healing and forgiveness, the radical grace of God, and the law's true intent, and boldly gambled it into the open market of the world. They took immense risk, think of Paul, to plant alternative communities that overcame social and political boundaries, which resulted in a massive spiritual return called the church. So the outer darkness, the third servant, represents the religious elite of Paul's day, and he was one of them. They viewed God as a harsh, rigid purist who would repay any and every mistake. Out of fear, they viewed Israel's unique covenant blessings and buried them. They viewed the unique covenant blessings of God and buried them in the dirt of separatism, ethnic purity, and nationalist revolutionary plots. They wanted to keep God's treasure safe and exclusive to themselves. So, next slide. So the lesson is for the church, without going into all the historical framework, within 3.5, 4 minutes of the beginning of the lesson, we have the lesson right here. Share God's wealth. Why? Because He has all of it. Share God's wealth. I'm not saying you don't. I'm not implying that you don't. I'm saying this is the message of the connection of the parable of the talents. Don't bury it. Share it. Okay? There we go. Jesus' parables orbit around the sun like priceless works of art. Okay, do you get the pun there? Jesus' parables orbit around the sun like priceless works of art. So we're going to talk about art a little bit today. That is Millikan University. That is in Decatur, Illinois, and I received an art grant out of high school to go to Millikan University. And so the art dean gave me a choice. He said, you can either play baseball or you can pursue art. And I said, I think I'll pursue baseball. And therefore, I did not go to Millikan University, but I wanted to tell you that I had an art grant because I was able to do a little bit, not nearly as good as the Fowler clan, no, but I had some ability. And so, sticking with the theme of art, I have told you this little legendary story where Pablo Picasso said to someone as he was sitting in a cafe, someone came up to him and they said, "Hey, you're Pablo Picasso." And he said, "Yes, I am." And he knew what was going to happen, and they said, "Could you just draw one little thing for me? And that would be so amazing if you could just do that little gesture for me, because I love your work so much." And so he did. And in 30 seconds, he drew something fascinating, gave it to the person, and he said, "That will be $30,000. And the person obviously said, Pablo, it only took you 30 seconds to do that. How could you be so insulting and say that cost me $30,000? He says, "Because it took me 30 years to learn how to draw that way." And that's cool, isn't it? That's not true, though. That's a legend. I tried to look it up. I tried to look up quote search and all of these things. It's a legend, but it has the weight of what we're talking about. What Pablo really did, I think, is he said, "It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to learn to paint like a child." In other words, what did Pablo Picasso do for his life? What was his life passion? It was to illustrate. It was to paint things, to make your eye look at things in a different way than you had ever seen before. And he wanted to do it better than anybody else. I don't even know that many of Pablo Picasso's works, but the premise is what we're talking about. The artwork of the Gospels, the artwork of Matthew writing a parable, the artwork of Paul saying what he says to any of his congregations is masterful. And they devoted their lives to choosing every word, every detail that makes up our Bibles that we have. And that is, to me, the most fascinating thing that we have, copies of what they actually said from 2,000 years ago. That is astonishing to me. The more and more I study, the more and more I get this impression of how Paul struggled his entire life, not only to present and herald the announcement of the gospel, but to make sure that everyone understood exactly what the gospel implied in his letters to the congregations. And Matthew would have done the same exact thing. So I go back to that verse in 1 Corinthians. Did he work harder than Matthew? Because Matthew seems like a pretty hard worker to me. Well, he said he did. So, the parables of Jesus are similar to a gallery of priceless Renaissance paintings. I'm selecting Renaissance. Like paintings that have accumulated centuries of discolored varnish, these parables have been obscured by centuries of modern individualism and therapeutic self-help interpretations. The task of studying is that of an art conservator, to carefully strip away the cultural grime of our contemporary era, exposing the vibrant, subversive, and politically explosive first century brushstrokes and colors of Jesus' depictions of God's kingdom breaking into the world. If the parables can be compared to priceless artworks, then a comparison between medieval art and Renaissance art should also be helpful for us. Some of you will already know the difference, and you will be able to critique me afterwards if I get something wrong. This is medieval art, and I want you to look at these paintings. There's going to be 2 or 3, and then there's going to be 3 or 4 of the Renaissance. I want you to notice the difference. Okay, so you're going to compare them and contrast them. I want you to notice the differences and maybe if there are similarities, and see if you can see with your eyes. He who has eyes to see, let him see. There's one, pretty strange, right? And then we'll come back to them and I'll explain what we may see or may not see. Yep, I'll go back. There you go. It takes a little time, like years, to see these. Now those 3 are medieval. Okay? This is Renaissance. What's different? What's the same? Okay, some of you will be able to tell me what the difference is. How many of you noticed in the medieval paintings that they're two-dimensional and flat? Yeah? Like that's, well, okay. How many of you noticed that they have outlines on the humans, like in black? Like, can you see where the arm is? Yes, very clearly. How many of you can see that one figure is bigger than the other? And that would have, according to research, suggested that that figure was more important in those paintings. Here you have, next, there you go. Here you have another two-dimensional flat painting. What about the colors? Do you see any vibrancy? Do you see any nuance? No, not necessarily. So if you get a chance and you go visit Royce, many of you already know this who go and visit Royce, you're going to see on his wall a painting of where he grew up in Virginia. Go look at that. And again, here you have flat, two-dimensional. What about the fact that they're fully clothed, like wrapped around? The only thing you see is their faces. Did you notice that? It's like just a lot of cloth there, right? Renaissance, a lot of cloth here too. But now what do you see maybe more of? You see motion. You see light. Most importantly, in some of these, you see something that you haven't seen in the other ones is dimension, which if you see right back into the center of the painting, you will see where they probably would have put a focal point and then created depth out from there. Here is the girl with the pearl earring and Mona Lisa. Johannes Vermeer with the girl with the pearl earring. What do you notice about those things? Well, do you see the black outlines on the girl with the pearl earring? No. What about Mona Lisa? No. So they blurred those to symbolize the idea of human reality, human realisticness. And the light is different. Light is a big deal where you get to see things differently. And what do you also see in the faces? You get to see emotion. You get to see some sort of emotion. Or look at Mona Lisa. Is that a grin? What is she thinking? Okay, here in the Last Supper, of course, there you have the dimension again, and then you have all kinds of motion and so forth. So medieval art was typically flat and, like we said, two-dimensional. Renaissance art was typically 3D, light, and had a lot of facial expressions. Those are poor summaries, but that is a easy contrast of what we've just seen. So Johannes Vermeer, girl with the pearl earring, and Da Vinci's Mona Lisa and the Last Supper are estimated to be worth $2 to $4.5 billion. I thought, I'd better look these up because what if I wanted to buy one? How much would they cost? Well, they're not gonna sell them to you anyway, right? Here's the thing. You would think that these paintings were always available to the public. They were not. King of France had, I think, Mona Lisa. And you have in Germany or in other maybe not Germany, other places, I think you had rocks thrown in one of the convents where they had the Last Supper hanging. The soldiers threw rocks and stuff at that thing before they said, no, let's keep that. And so these were not available to the public. These masterpieces were not available to the public. I'm sure there are other masterpieces in the world that are not available to the public. Parables are like masterpieces, works of art that surround Jesus. I want you to let that sink in because the lesson is what? Share the wealth. Don't bury it. Don't keep it private. Why? Because this is what the lesson of the parable of the talents is all about. Things associated with life and wealth in the Bible and the parables are common, and you and I can see common threads. One of these things I thought would be interesting for you is that is a shop from this area. And I didn't know that they sold victorious vines, faithful figs, covenant olive trees, lost sheep, and wedding feasts. Yeah, and they are priceless. In the Bible, those symbols are priceless symbols of wealth and life, and that is what Jesus is using throughout his parables to illustrate something about Israel's relationship with God, and that's what we have in the parable of the talents as well. Israel had the wealth of God, but those whom Jesus is critiquing in Matthew 23, the scribes, the Pharisees, the religious elite, he is talking about how they have hoarded that wealth for themselves, trying to protect it, and therefore they're the ones that are going to enter into the outer darkness. And outer darkness really means that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, and they're no longer going to be able to hoard that wealth. The temple and the city will be destroyed by the Romans. Outer darkness does not mean hell in that sense. So we get to the parable of the talents again, and I'm going to give you, I think, 3 views, popular views, and then we'll contrast this and end our lesson. So popular view number 1, the stewardship and personal abilities view, which is the most common. So this is the premise. This view treats the word talent as a literal linguistic precursor to our modern English word for natural skills, intelligence, and athletic or artistic gifts. So we do get the word talent from the Greek word talenton, but this is the premise that now, since we get that word in our English language, that's what the parable means. And so the interpretation is the master is God, and the talents are the individual combinations of money, time, and abilities given to each person at birth. The first two servants represented proactive, hardworking Christians who maximize their skills for church ministries and career excellence. The third servant represents a lazy, unmotivated believer who wastes their potential out of fear or apathy. That's a popular view. I've heard that 100,000 times. And it's always frightening to hear that because you're thinking, is that really what he's talking about? Am I really wasting my talent? You know how many times I've heard people say, you should have played baseball instead of become a minister. You would have made so much money and you would have had so many abilities to influence other people with the gospel. And I'm saying to them, if you had any idea what was behind the scenes in professional baseball, not all, but a lot of professional baseball, you would run from it. Because there is greed and idolatry, sex, drugs, everything, every night. And that's why so many athletes get caught up in it. And I didn't want to be a part of that lifestyle. The focal point, the individual performance and personal accountability, that's what these sermons are about. I'm criticizing preachers. Sermons utilizing this view focus heavily on personal responsibility. Anything wrong with that? No. It's motivating the congregation to volunteer, give financially. In other words, guilt trip you into doing things, right? And excel in their daily secular vocations as a form of worship. Sounds pretty good to me, right? Wrong. That's not what the parable is about. It's not a guilt trip. Popular view number 2. The dispensational end times view. The premise, situated within the context of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus in Matthew 24 and 25. This view interprets the parable strictly as a predictive, prophetic timeline regarding the close of the current age. So the interpretation is the master's departure represents Jesus' ascension into heaven, and the long time before his return represents the entire church age. The servants are not just individual humans, but factions within the professing church waiting for the second coming. The multiplication of the talents represents true saving faith that naturally produces spiritual fruit in evangelistic conversions. The third servant represents a nominal or false Christian, someone who sits in a church pew but has a dead, unregenerate heart. The focal point, the certainty of future cosmic judgment, condemnation. Hear the tone? The master returning to settle accounts is viewed as a stark warning about the final judgment, where those who without genuine spiritual fruit will be cast into hell, outer darkness. Like I said, outer darkness is not what Jesus' emphasis is. He's talking about a historical reality within his own nation, Israel, and just giving you things to think about. Number 3, the socioeconomic liberationist view, which is anti-imperial reading. The premise, popularized by modern social scientific and liberation theologians such as Richard Horsley, this view reads the parable through the harsh lens of first century Roman agrarian economics. The interpretation, in the ancient world, wealthy landowners typically accumulated massive fortunes by exploiting peasant laborers, foreclosing on family lands, charging exorbitant interest. In this reading, the master is not a figure for God. He is a predatory, greedy tycoon. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? The first 2 servants are corrupt middle managers who willingly participate in this exploitative system to get rich. The twist, the third servant is the heroic whistleblower. By bearing the talent, he actively stops the cycle of predatory lending. When the master returns, the third servant courageously exposes the truth to his face. I knew you were a hard man. Reaping where you didn't sow. His subsequent banishment into the outer darkness is viewed as the tragic, predictable consequence faced by activists who dare to stand up against oppressive economic or political regimes. The focal point, systemic critique and justice for the oppressed. This view shifts the parable from a lesson on obedience to an exposure on how worldly systems exploit the vulnerable, contrasting sharply with the upside-down ethics of the true kingdom of God. Sounds good in some ways. Some truth to that. There's truth in all of it. Truth in every view, to some degree. How do we know? Well, the masters, the authors, Matthew, Luke, John, Mark, even Paul talking about certain things, They know how to draw your eye in a different way. And so what we have is, again, that public investment view is drawing your eye to a different view. Enter into the joy. Notice in the previous view, there is no entering into the joy of the master. Okay? The first two servants represent followers of Jesus who understood that the wealth of God's covenant was meant to be shared. By going out and trading, they represent the risky missionary work of the early church. We started this sermon by talking about someone who risked his entire life to go out for Jesus and say things so that people would come to an understanding of what had happened in history and that they might come to repentance and know the loving God that cherishes everybody. It made me think of Jesus Christ and how it helped me view the understanding of how hard Jesus worked every day of his life to shape these parables, to shape his texts, to work at telling everyone these things repetitively. Remember, he said, I didn't speak anything without a parable. Everybody was getting the same things, and it was exhausting work. And it continues to be exhausting work. So you and I have the lesson. The general lesson is God has given us something so beyond money, so priceless, that we can't hoard it. It's impossible to hoard it. And yet we sometimes try. Yet we sometimes try to bury it. And we need help. We need God's wisdom and guidance. We need prayer. We need each other. We need help to share God's wealth. It is that bountiful. That's it. That's your lesson. So I want you to think, again, about the parables, that I'm leading you in a direction to look at the parables from a historical context, a socio-political historical context that is very difficult to get, first of all, and then try to understand all of the sayings in between. And these things change how the eye looks. One view, or at least the popular views, cast fear upon everybody all the time. Because if you don't do what you should be doing, then I don't know what's going to happen to you, is the feeling you will get. And I got that feeling so much. And I'm not saying that I'm turning everything into a non-judgmental thing. That's not the point. The point is that I want to know the true parables that Jesus told to an ancient society that I've never been a part of. And I think that you all agree with the fact that we need to know the truth about these parables. And it's going to take a lot of work to get down to that truth. And so let's do our best and think about what the masters of these parables, this priceless artwork we call a collection, a library, a Bible, the priceless artwork that they have composed for us is, once you look at it, and if you look at it seriously, you're going to have to be like, okay, now, that's different. There's something different about that. It's not two-dimensional flat. It's more like Renaissance art that is three-dimensional, light. It doesn't have lines. It's not clear lines on the arms and on the face. It looks like they have expressions. What are they thinking? What are they doing? What's the point? All of these historical context questions are being asked by the authors of the Bible for us to meditate and share, because it is absolutely wealth. These things that we're sharing, these words that we're talking about, are absolutely wealthy things that the world needs to hear. If you have a need this morning, if you need to be baptized into the wealthiest person you know, Jesus Christ, You're welcome to do that as together we stand and sing the invitation song.